Tonight, Rishi Sunak under fire for the Conservative government's record as Keir Starmer refuses to rule out a series of tax rises. Will any of it shift the dial? Good evening. Welcome to Newsnight with the best insight into tonight's interviews Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer gave to Sky's Beth Rigby and the answers they both gave to that audience of voters in Grimsby. We're going to talk live to the Home Secretary and Labour's Shadow Paymaster General. As soon as we establish comms, we can see them, we can't quite hear them yet. And we're going to speak to the Deputy Leader of the Greens, Zach Belansky. There he is. Our political panel tonight: Philip Collins, former speechwriter for Tony Blair and Keir Starmer, and Salma Shah, who was special advisor to ex-Tory Home Secretary Sajid Javid. First, some highlights of tonight's battle for number 10 on Sky.
No tax rises in the next Parliament.
No tax rises needed in the plans in our manifesto.
In the plans?
No tax rises for working people. That's income tax, national insurance,
so you're
and
not
VAT.
ruling out.
But over the last year, I feel like you've formed into more of a politician than the person that I would have voted for to run the country. You seem more like a political robot. How are you going to convince others like me to vote for you?
Well, the most... Look, I came into politics quite late in life. I'd done other things beforehand, but I took the decision that I couldn't take the issues, make the changes that I thought were necessary unless I went into politics. I was frustrated.
It's a catalogue of broken promises. You must surely see why so many voters think it's time for you and the Conservatives to get your P45.
Of course I can understand people's frustrations. It's been a very difficult few years.
I'm a former Conservative Party chair and a lifelong True Blue, but in this election I find myself an undecided voter. Actions taken by this government actually make me feel ashamed.
Well, I think you had a question earlier from, I think there was a junior doctor here, and I think everyone knows the impact the industrial action has had. That's why we haven't made as much...
So it's the doctor's fault.
Well, let's go live to the spin room in Grimsby and speak to Home Secretary James Cleverly and Shadow Paymaster General Jonathan Ashworth. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for speaking to Newsnight and to our audience. Jonathan Ashworth, in 2019, Keir Starmer told the country Jeremy Corbyn would make a great Prime Minister. Tonight, he claimed he only said that because he knew Labour was going to lose. What sort of a man does that?
Well, let's be clear. That election in 2019 was the... Sorry, I'm getting quite a lot of repeating in my ear. Can I just tell that for a second? That election in 2019, the Labour Party got absolutely hammered. And the British electorate sent the Labour Party a clear message. And we listened to the electorate. And what we have done, we've changed the Labour Party. Keir Starmer has changed the Labour Party, and he'll change the country.
Right.
And Jeremy Corbyn is not a Labour candidate.
I'm actually asking you, not about how he's changed the Labour Party.
But the woman who crashed the economy, sent mortgages soaring, Liz Truss is still a Conservative Party candidate in this general election. That's the difference between the strong leadership of Keir Starmer and the weak leadership of Rishi Sunak. OK. I appreciate you had to take the earpiece out in order to answer, so I'm going to apologise for the technicals, but actually I wasn't asking you how Keir Starmer had changed the party. I was asking you what sort of a man says one thing in 2019 about Jeremy Corbyn. He told the country he would make a great Prime Minister. Tonight, he reckons he only said it because he knew Labour was going to lose. Now, that's either disingenuous or dishonest. Which is it? No, I don't accept the premise of your question. I've been in the Labour Party since I was 15. Keir Starmer has been a lifelong member and supporter of the Labour Party, apart from the time through when he was running the Crime Prosecution Service and it wasn't appropriate to be a member of a political party. We're not going to make any apology for trying to get Labour candidates elected. The Labour Party is the greatest force for social justice this country has ever seen. Everybody knows that the Labour Party was going to get hammered in 2019. I actually said it. James, when he was party chair, put out a recording of me saying it. So it's not a surprise that Labour politicians knew that we weren't going to win in 2019. The difference is this, though. We knew we had to change the Labour Party.
Okay.
Keir Starmer did change the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn is not a candidate in this election. The woman who ran our economy off a cliff and sent mortgages through the roof is a Tory party candidate. And again, Rishi Sunak will make the same mistakes that Liz Truss made, putting up borrowing to pay for this desperate wish list he produced yesterday.
I'm going to come back to that.
And working families face an increase in their mortgage of £4,800.
OK, I will come back to that 4,000 figure, because that is as dodgy as the 2,000 figure you accused the Tories when it came to the Labour tax attack on you. James Cleverly, despite the tax cuts the Conservatives announced yesterday with your manifesto, Rishi Sunak would not acknowledge that the tax burden, if the Conservatives win this election, will go up. You're going to be honest with the voters tonight and tell them, yes, it will go up.
Well, the tax burden as a percentage of GDP is entirely dependent on GDP. And actually what we have seen, because of the decisions that the Prime Minister took, we've seen inflation coming down. That will inevitably have a knock-on effect for public finances. It's why we've now got the financial headroom to have those targeted tax cuts in our manifesto, tax cuts on families with children, tax cuts on working people, tax cuts on the self-employed, protecting pensioners from a Labour tax grab. And of course the point about borrowing as a percentage of GDP is entirely dependent on GDP, and as the Prime Minister said, we don't know what the GDP is going to be. We have a plan to grow it, and therefore it is not the case that that is an accurate statement. And actually, when it comes to being open and honest, the point that you made in your question, Jonathan, I was shocked, genuinely shocked, when someone that aspires to be Prime Minister basically said, oh, it's fine for me to lie because I never thought I'd be caught out. I find that genuinely unacceptable. That 3 weeks out from a general election, someone who aspires to be Prime Minister basically says it's fine as long as you don't get caught.
And voters might be genuinely shocked that you can't say the tax take for this year is 36.5% of GDP, and if you get back in and enact your tax cuts, it will rise to 36.7% of GDP. So that's higher than now, which means the tax burden is going up, correct?
No, that's a projection. And actually what we've seen with a lot of financial projections, they have underestimated the performance of the UK economy.
Right, so suddenly the OBR is not good enough for you anymore.
The longest downturn in a century. That turned out not to be the case. We got the economy back into growth. We were projected to have very high inflation rates for an extended period. We brought those inflation rates down. So projections have been consistently wrong in terms of the performance of the UK economy.
OK, so I'm just checking.
Those projections are just that. They're projections. We don't agree with them. And that's why the Prime Minister didn't accept the premise of that question.
They're OBR projections. Suddenly you don't agree with the OBR anymore. You're turning into Liz Truss, are you?
No, the OBR has consistently underestimated the economy. So this is the OBR plays an important role, of course it does, but if you look back, the OBR has consistently adjusted upwards in terms of the performance of the UK economy, and that is I mean, you can check the figures, that is a well-established fact.
I have checked the figures. I've just read them out to you, and they come from the OBR, which Jeremy Hunt and the Prime Minister have been very keen to say is absolutely what they should be using to mark your homework. Jonathan Ashworth, you said the Prime Minister was lying last week when he came up with that £2,000 tax figure, which he said people would be paying if Labour win the election. You've now come up with your own figure. You say if you vote Conservative, it will mean £4,800 on everyone's mortgage. That is just as spurious. Full Fact of today called it very speculative and based on multiple assumptions. So you are as misleading and disrespectful to voters as you say the Conservatives are.
No, on the contrary. You'll recall that Rishi Sunak lied to the British public last week by claiming that impartial civil servants had done the calculations, provided the assumptions, and exonerated that figure. That was exposed the morning after when the Treasury Permanent Secretary issued a letter debunking that. So Rishi Sunak lied. He lied about the impartial civil service and he lied to the British people. What we have done is that we've gone through the manifesto of the Tory party yesterday using very conservative assumptions. And actually, when you read that manifesto, it is a long, desperate wish list, as long as your arm, of commitments where they cannot find the funding, from savings which will not materialise. The money is simply not there. And if you add up, you tot up all of those commitments, it can only be paid for by borrowing, which will put pressure on interest rates and put up mortgage rates.
I don't know why you sound so angry.
For that is the formula the formula Treasury produced.
I don't know why you sound so angry, because what you've done is come up with one assumption and said, if this happens, and then if this happens, and then if this happens, this might happen. It's embarrassing.
Well, I don't think I'm angry particularly. But I am angry on behalf of working people who are paying so much more on their mortgage thanks to the decisions taken by the Conservatives.
Okay.
So, yes, I'm angry for people who are really struggling, who've seen their mortgage go up by hundreds of pounds a month and they're paying thousands of pounds a week. I'm sorry if you think that anger is perhaps too much, but I am angry that British people are paying so much under the Conservatives.
Mr Cleverly, do you think Rishi Sunak looked like his heart was in it tonight?
Well, I think what we saw from the Prime Minister was clear and unambiguous answers to tough questions. And they were tough questions. And he was completely open about the times when we haven't achieved what we hoped to achieve. I think he was very clear that on the priority, which was to bring down inflation, which unlocks almost everything else, we have overachieved, in fact. But we recognise there's work to do. That's why we want to form the next government. And with regard to the figures that Jonathan was talking about, he's using the word lie, which I think is a strong and completely unjustified word, because you can go onto the Treasury website, gov.uk, and you can see the calculations that were done by Treasury civil servants. The letter from Simon Case, the senior civil servant in the British government, said that the figures were produced by the civil servants were based on very conservative estimates of the Labour Party's policy. You can crunch the numbers yourself and you can see what the civil servants have done.
You're doing what they're doing. I've got a final
question.
The difference is,
Victoria, there is the difference. The difference is you can go onto the website and you can see the figures produced by Treasury civil servants that we're using. No such figures exist for the made-up nonsense that Jonathan's been talking about.
OK, final question for you, Mr Cleverly. Let's fast forward a month or so. Let's imagine the polls are accurate and that Labour win, and the Tories are looking for a new leader. You have retained your seat in this scenario. Will you stand for the leadership?
I am campaigning to win this election and return a Conservative government. And the message that I would say to anyone who is daydreaming about what they would do in the aftermath of a Conservative defeat is to work to avoid that Conservative defeat. That's what I'm doing. I'm not going to speculate. I never have done. I've always answered this the same way. I'm relentlessly focused on winning the election, getting myself re-elected, but also getting a Conservative government elected. And that is my exclusive focus.
And just to check then, you are not daydreaming about being leader of the Tory party after this election?
No, absolutely. And look, I've been boringly consistent about this. It's not the first time I've been asked about this. I ran for leadership back in 2016. I wasn't successful. And what I have done is relentlessly try to serve the British people to the best of my abilities, whether it be in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office or in the Home Office. That is what I remain focused on, because this is about service, not about personal ambition. It's about service to the British people. And I genuinely believe the British people are best served by having a government that has a plan rather than a set of pipe dreams like the Labour Party.
Thank you both very much. Thank you for being with us and coping with the technicals. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And Nick is there in Grimsby. What are people around you saying about how well or otherwise both leaders did?
Well, naturally, Vic, we're in the spin room, so there has been an awful lot of spinning involving the two politicians you've just had. So I was in the other spin room for the press down that corridor there, and the debate had barely ended, and in marched John Ashworth saying Keir Starmer knocked it out of the path. Shortly after that, we had Sir Mark Spencer, who's the Environment Minister for the Conservatives. He gave Rishi Sunak a good 8 out of 10, and obviously the Tories thought they needed to pump up the volume a bit. So in marched James cleverly, and he said 0 out of 10 for Keir Starmer. So a lot of spinning, and I do have to say, Vic, it did remind me of that great line from Primary Colours, which is that losers spin, winners grin. So maybe they both lost, but there was a Snap YouGov poll, and that said that Keir Starmer had won 64 to 36. Important, it's a Snap poll, so let's see what the other polls show tomorrow. But I really think, Vic, that this was quite an uncomfortable experience for both politicians. Uncomfortable with all those questions from Beth Rigby, uncomfortable with those questions from the audience, focusing on their past and focusing on their future. So as you picked up, Vic, Keir Starmer, why did you want Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister? Because you were campaigning for a Labour victory in 2019. And Keir Starmer said, I never thought he would win. That doesn't exactly hit the transparency mark. Pressure under tax. So Keir Starmer giving that commitment, no rise in VAT, no rise in national insurance, no rise in income tax, but would not give such a specific commitment. No plans for other tax rises. Beth Rigby said, we know what no plans means. For Rishi Sunak, on the past, Beth Rigby pointing out you failed to meet most of your promises. And on the future, that point about how you may, Rishi Sunak, be saying that individual taxes are coming down, but the overall tax burden is going up. Why is that? James Cleverly was talking about that. It's because of this thing called fiscal drag. Because the tax bands are not rising with inflation, that brings many more people into the higher tax bands, not due to change till 2028. That is how that tax burden goes up. Finally, really interesting point, what did they not say? Rishi Sunak, he talked about nothing else at the debate last week other than what he claimed was a £2,000 tax rise under Labour. No mention of that. You were talking about that claim from Rachel Reeves that the Conservative manifesto will lead to a £4,800 rise in mortgage rates. Didn't hear that from Keir Starmer.
Thank you very much, Nick. Let's talk to Philip Collins and Salma Shah, who are here. Who won, in your view?
Well, I think that given that Rishi Sunak needed something remarkable to happen, you'd have to say, therefore, Keir Starmer won the debate, because even if it were a draw, Keir Starmer's winning. I think on the balance of it, Keir Starmer gave a basically accomplished performance, and Rishi Sunak at times I felt looked like he was sort of broken. So I felt on the balance of it, Keir Starmer won anyway, but he only needed to not collapse, and he's so far ahead that would count as a victory.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with that assessment, and the Snap poll gave a really distinct lead for Keir Starmer. So the discomfort that I think the Prime Minister felt about trying to defend the government's record, I think, was apparent. I think at times he got a little bit shirty about certain apologies. He didn't handle that particularly deftly. And I think as well, you know, even though you're broadcasting to the nation, what's happening in the audience and the audience reaction can also be a real important indicator, but also I think can throw you off slightly. And I think the audience wasn't on the Prime Minister's side this evening.
But he did get some rounds of applause, as did Keir Starmer, and both gentlemen were laughed at points. Can I ask you about the failure by Keir Starmer, or rather the ability of Keir Starmer to rule out rises in income tax, VAT and national insurance, and conspicuously not rule out rises in other taxes like capital gains? Yeah, is that going to be an issue?
It might be. I mean, it's standard political tactic not to rule out everything. I mean, if you rule out every single conceivable method of raising revenue, then you've got nowhere to go.
Sure. It's just very conspicuous now, though, isn't it?
It is very conspicuous. I mean, I think both sides of it are conspicuous. Firstly, the things which are ruled out are also conspicuous, and it's worth dwelling on them, that Labour governments in the past have gone into elections without ruling out the increases in those taxes, and they are the most salient ones for people's income. So that's conspicuous, but so is the fact that you do want to leave yourself a little room, because who knows what might happen? Who knows what shocks might come to the economy? If you've ruled out absolutely everything prior to that, then it's really quite a foolish thing to do.
Yeah. Has the leadership contest in the Tory party begun? James Cudley said he's not daydreaming about being the next Tory leader, and then he reminded us all of the various jobs he'd done in public service. Did that sound like him going through his greatest hits?
I thought it was slightly interesting that he was referring to public service and not personal ambition, and then talking about all the big jobs that he enjoyed doing, serving the public. So there was a little bit of sort of CV flashing there. The Conservative contest, I think, for the leadership began a while ago, and I think that's not just about people.
Who's on manoeuvres then?
Well, I mean, all the names that you're reading about in the papers,
Go on,
the
tell
Tom
our audience.
Tugendhat, Kemi Badenoch, Penny Mordaunt, certainly, and even Suella Braverman on the sort of reform side of things. You know, she's obviously still trying to remind people that she's there and she's got a view.
And why, with those names that you've just mentioned, do you say they're on manoeuvres? What is it that each of those have done that means someone like you knows, OK, that they want the top job?
So I don't think it's necessarily something that they do directly. I think because we're all in the firmament, it's the way people are spoken about. And I think before even an individual is considering, you know, what their run is, there's always people behind that are sort of, you know, in people's ear and saying, well, you know, obviously this isn't going to go well, so we need to think about who's the future. And then they start sort of talking people up. It might be completely outside of those individuals' control, but I think once you start hearing that, you sort of become part of a contest, whether you like it or not.
Go on, decode it for our audience. Why are those names people who might be on manoeuvres?
Well, there's firstly the thought of who's going to survive this election. So we don't know that all of those people you mentioned will retain their seats, that they may or they may not. So the electorate might have something to say about the next contest for the Tory leadership. But the party has a big question to answer about its direction. And the leader is the personification of a direction. So if the Tory party responds to a defeat by thinking, we've just been rejected for being quite close to reform, let's go even closer to reform, in the entirely mistaken assumption that that's a good idea, then they'd choose one leader. Whereas if they were to think, actually, we've just been completely lambasted by the electorate and we need to move back to a more sensible position nearer the centre, then they'd choose someone else. My strong suspicion is that they are desperate to indulge themselves, as parties often are after an election, and they will veer backwards towards the right. And that will create even more space for the
And you
Labour
say it's
Party.
backwards. What do you say?
I think that's following a pattern that happened post-97. So, you know, if you were looking backwards on this model, this is something that is likely to happen. I think that if you have names like Tom Tugendhat in the mix, that they might be a bit more right-wing on security, but might be a bit more liberal. But I think all of these questions and all of these sort of manoeuvrings, you've got to remember that all of the people whose names are in the frame, I mean, there might be others, they have actually all run and had a go at the leadership of the Conservative Party previously, so you sort of know where they are. We don't actually know what's going to happen, and as you say, who's actually left in this campaign and who still wants to have a shot at it and what kind of support they may have.
We will show it in a few minutes. We've got a graphic which shows which of the Conservative big beasts, if you want to call them that, certainly cabinet ministers, may actually lose their seat this time. But we'll show you that, and we'll talk about that in just a moment or two. Let's go back to Nick. Can we have a quick look ahead to the launch of the Labour manifesto, which is obviously out tomorrow? Are there going to be any surprises, Nick?
Well, in a sense, Vic, we've got a little flavour of that surprise tonight. What we're going to see tomorrow is a Labour leader who hails from the left of Tony Blair, who, if he becomes a Labour Prime Minister, will govern to the right of Tony Blair, because Keir Starmer said, unlike previous Labour governments, we will not turn on the spending taps. And I said to one of Keir Starmer's aides, is he really saying that? He's not going to be like Tony Blair? And they said, absolutely. You'll remember Tony Blair stuck to the Tory spending limits for 2 years and then started spending. They're saying it's different times. The big focus tomorrow will be on wealth creation, trying to reform the planning laws and all that sort of stuff to create wealth. But what they are saying is one lesson from the last Labour government is if that wealth creation can create the sort of wealth that you got under the last Labour government, that would be £70 billion extra for public services.
Thank you, Nick. Today, the Green Party launched its manifesto promising big spending running into hundreds of billions of pounds if you vote for them. They want to get to net zero faster, end tuition fees, privatise all the utilities and say they would spend $50 billion more for health and social care by 2030. Their deputy leader is Zach Polanski and he's here to talk to you. Hello, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Big sums of money in your manifesto. You want to increase taxes by over $170 billion per year to fund a $160 billion increase in spending on public services. However, the IFS says it's unlikely your measures would raise as much revenue as you expect. Do you accept that?
So this is a huge moment for our country, and what the Green Party are offering are real hope and real change. Now, within our numbers that you're asking about with the IFS, I think there's a mixed bag here. So ultimately what we're looking at is a wealth tax. That's a 1% tax on people with assets of over £10 million or more, and a 2% tax on people with £1 billion assets or more.
And this
so
is what
that's
they
the tax.
say. It's unlikely that the specific tax-raising measures the Greens propose would raise the sorts of sums they claim, and certainly not without real economic cost.
Well, so I challenge that, because we've seen in countries, particularly some of the Scandinavian countries, where this has entirely worked. I think the other
Most countries have dropped their wealth tax. I mean, in 1990, there were like 12 countries who had a wealth tax. There's about 3 now, because they don't raise as much as people think.
Well, some of those taxes are much bigger. We're talking about a 1% tax on a wealth tax. So the story you often hear, and this comes from other people, is about capital flight. But actually, I'd always say, you know, people invest in wealth in this country because they're proud of this country, the culture in this country,
so
the community
none
in
of
this
these
country.
millionaires and billionaires would leave the country?
Well, I think that would be a misunderstanding of why they're here. I think we should be more patriotic than that. And
It's not about patriotism, it's about evidence, isn't it? In other countries where they've had a wealth tax, millionaires have left because they don't want to pay it.
Well, again, there's places like Switzerland that has plenty of rich people and plenty of wealthy people there. So I think it is about evidence. But also I think when I say it's about patriotism, it's expecting more from this country, that people invest here because they want to be here, not because we're some depository of wealth. And actually, that's a really bad way to run an economy, because wealth ultimately becomes stagnant. It doesn't be part of our public services. And we need to defend our National Health Service. We know that the Labour Party are talking about privatisation through the front door. And actually, by putting £50 billion into our National Health Service, that would ultimately heal it and make it have the support that it needs. It's not just for National Health Service, it's, of course, our active travel, it's public transport, it's about building council homes. We have a waiting list of over 1 million households. We need to create those council homes, and all of that will require money.
Okay.
The Green Party are a party that are being straight with people, that will require investment, which will require wealth tax.
And borrowing. I mean, as well as all those tax rises, by 2026, you'll be borrowing £85 billion extra a year. That's double what Liz Truss wanted to borrow for tax cuts in a mini budget. You are going to crash the economy.
So Liz Truss crashed the economy because that borrowing was about unfunded tax cuts.
Yeah, this is also unfunded borrowing.
Well, no, because we're also talking about we're bringing in the other end too, with wealth taxes, a carbon tax, and also bringing capital gains tax.
No, I'm going to pause you right there.
Tax.
Let's be absolutely clear with voters. So you want to raise taxes, 170 billion a year, to fund 160 billion increase in spending. As on top of that, you're going to borrow 85 billion. Borrow. It was the borrowing that undid Liz Truss. It was the bond markets who said, you can't borrow that much, Liz Truss. So we're going to go crazy. And you're proposing to do more than she did.
So when we're looking at this is nowhere near where Spain, France, Germany are. Well, Germany's even further, and Japan. I think ultimately it is about being straight with people. And when we see those two old parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party...
No, you're not answering the question, Mr.
I am entirely. They're talking about the scale of the crisis, but they're not willing to borrow the money that we need to invest in our public infrastructure.
Because of what happened in September 2022. Have you not learned from that in the Greens?
Well, I've come back straight to the same point. That was borrowing for unfunded tax cuts.
That was borrowing. That was borrowing.
Yes, but it wasn't borrowing for our infrastructure. And actually, the crumbling infrastructure we have in this country is one of the biggest things holding us back. And actually, by investing in that infrastructure...
So you think the markets wouldn't go crazy if you borrow over 5 years? It's £325 billion. You think the bond markets, the financial markets would go, no, that's absolutely fine. We're not going to go crazy. Mortgage rates are not going to shoot up.
Well, I'll defer to experts on that, people like the Wealth Tax Commission. In fact, one of their economists on BBC Verify today said our plans are economically credible. We've also got people at the University of Greenwich who have been doing modelling of what this might look like in the future. As I say, these are difficult questions because they're eye-watering sums, but we're living in a cost of living crisis, which is really an inequality crisis. And the only way we're going to sort this out is by being straight with people that we need to invest these huge sums of money, because more than anything, we have a climate crisis. Now, that often gets pitted against the cost of living crisis. But if you insulate every single home in Britain that needs it, that's a triple win. Reduces bills, because we have some of the leakiest homes in Europe, reduces emissions because we're in a climate crisis, and it creates those good green jobs, which is exactly answering the question you're coming to. By creating those jobs and industry, that's how we get the economy moving. And if we do politics in the same way that it's been done for the past 14 years, or even under Tony Blair and before that, that's a politics that is leaving people vulnerable, that is leaving working class people in the worst state they've ever been. Ultimately, we need to stand up for those marginalised communities by making sure we're redistributing money around our economy.
Something that's recently disappeared from your website, your widely condemned policy to reduce the number of caesareans women have in childbirth. These were the exact words on the website. We will work to reduce the number of interventions in childbirth and change the culture of the NHS so that birth is treated as a normal and non-medical event. Does the Green Party now accept that that is a totally retrograde step that puts ideology before women and their babies' health?
So this is a really sensitive subject, and the most important principle in answer to your question is a woman always has the right to choose what happens to her body. Policy needs to be decided by health experts, and in fact in the Green Party I'm proud that our education policy is overlooked by teachers and our health policy is overlooked by GPs.
How did this get on your website?
This was never going to be in the manifesto and certainly isn't in the manifesto. What we do have, and it's slightly processy, but if you'll bear with me for 20 seconds, policy is decided in the Green Party, one member, one vote. So any member can decide policy, get together, and that's essentially what we vote for at conference. I'm really proud of that because that's a very democratic way.
But you're not proud of this?
It's totally different. Well, what happens with that is evolving policy. Now, with evolving policy, that is not in our manifesto and is not the platform I'm here to stand on tonight.
Sure.
That's essentially
How did it make it onto your website?
Well, as I say, any member can come up with policy, and that's what ends up on the website. That's obviously difficult when it comes to questions like this, but I think that's a democratic way to do things, and that's the real hope and real change that the Green Party offer, a different way of doing politics.
OK, thank you very much, Mr.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Right, back to the Prime Minister, who was also on ITV tonight, as well as Sky, being interviewed by Paul Brand. It's the interview he came back from D-Day to record last Thursday. Here's a clip.
What did you go without as a child?
We went out with lots of things, right? Because my parents wanted to put everything into our education, and that was a priority.
So what sort of things had to be sacrificed?
Lots of things, right?
Can you give me an example of
all sorts
something?
of things. So, like lots of people, there'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV. So that was something that we never had growing up, actually.
Salma Shah, you were a special advisor to a Tory cabinet minister. What did you think of that response?
The problem with that response is that it's completely authentic and it's accurate. He may have missed having Sky TV growing up, but it doesn't resonate, and every attempt that he makes to be relatable sort of falls flat. I think actually he should take a sort of a lesson from David Cameron, who was always accused of being, you know, elite because he was an Etonian. And where David always just said, look, it's not about where I came from, it's where I'm going. And he didn't try and apologise for his background. The virtue was that he wanted to give something back. And I think Rishi needs to be more aware of the fact that maybe that's not how people regard him.
With these debates, with these one-to-one interviews where you sit there for half an hour and you are grilled, you gain that stuff with your advisors, don't you? I mean, Rishi Sunak must know almost every time he does an interview, whether it's with a voter or an interviewer, he's going to be asked about his wealth.
Yeah, you do game it, but politics is really brutal. It really exposes your deficiencies. There's something very forensic about the scrutiny you're under in a campaign like this, that eventually everybody gets found out in politics. Slowly or quickly you get found out. Rishi Sunak's getting found out quite quickly. He's just not very adept at those things. He's not very skillful. And so although, of course, he'll have been through preparation, but when you're there and suddenly you can't think on your feet, and it was authentic, and that was exactly the problem with it. In context, what he was trying to say, I can now fill in for him the answer he should have given rather too late. What he was trying to say was that as my parents, his parents, were so obsessed with our education that took priority over everything else. And we, of course, had to go without some other things in order to ensure that could be looked after. Now, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. He's not therefore saying the things I went without are food. And that would have been a reasonable answer. But he just completely got lost and allowed the questioner to stick him on the question of what was it?
But
it was the TV.
But Phil, here's the problem, is that he answered a question directly, and quite often, you know, we hear it all the time, people criticise politicians for not answering things directly, and that's what he did. And both of us now, as that year, criticising him for answering something directly.
Well, quite, because he's a novice. And another thing people often say is we need people in politics who've done other things before. And I always think, no, we don't. We want people in politics who've done politics, so they know what they're actually doing, so they don't fall over on an elementary question like that, because it was actually really kind of easy. It wasn't even a tough question.
Other things that have happened today, we've had Grant Shapps on the radio warning of a Labour supermajority. Geoffrey Cox talking about sleepwalking into a socialist, one-state socialist country, and Tom Tugendhat apparently on manoeuvres. Does that suggest to you that we're at a point now, with 3 weeks to go, there are some Conservatives saying out loud what they might have been saying privately for a while, which is that the Conservatives are going to lose?
I think the strategy has always been one that is about damage limitation. I think the election...
But not publicly.
So that's exactly right. I think that's always been the strategy behind the scenes. And there is the air war and the ground campaign. And I think there are lots of people who are trying to secure their own seats and their own constituencies who might be saying something a bit different to the air war on the doorstep. But halfway through an election campaign, you really do need to keep that message disciplined. So however much you might think that actually our best case scenario is now to say don't give Keir Starmer a supermajority, articulating that is not the best thing at this point.
OK, we're out of time. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you for being with us and talking to our viewers. That is it for tonight. I'm back tomorrow. Till then, good night.